The German general lieutenant stares at the map table in the damp command bunker, listening to the low, throbbing drone of transport planes hidden in the night sky overhead. He knows exactly what is falling into the darkness: paratroopers. To the Wehrmacht High Command, the arrival of Allied airborne forces signals immediate chaos, but it also signals a tactical opportunity. They view the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st as reckless gangsters, men who fight with the erratic, uncoordinated violence of a saloon brawl. The German doctrine predicts that if you cut these Americans off from their inexhaustible supply lines, if you isolate them in the snow or the mud without their radio links and artillery, their morale will shatter. The Germans expect them to break because they believe Americans cannot fight without luxury. But when the intelligence officer whispers that maroon berets have been spotted in the sector, the mood in the bunker darkens instantly. These are the British Airborne, the Red Devils. The German commanders know from bitter experience in the dust of North Africa and the ruins of Arnhem that these men do not operate by the logic of logistics. They fight with a cold, terrifying discipline that seems indifferent to the concept of survival. The Germans believe that to encircle an American airborne unit is to force a surrender negotiation, but they know that to encircle a British airborne unit is to step willingly into a meat grinder. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about US and British battlefield dominance.
To understand this duality of fear, we must trace the lineage of these two elite forces back to the moment of their conception, for they were born from two entirely different, desperate needs. The concept of vertical envelopment, dropping an army behind enemy lines, was not an Allied invention. It was a German nightmare brought to life in the Blitzkrieg of 1940. The fall of the fortress of Eben Emael to German gliders and the seizure of Crete by the Fallschirmjäger shocked the Allied High Command. They realized that the sky was no longer a flank that could be ignored. But how the United States and Great Britain chose to copy this weapon revealed the fundamental chasm in their military souls. For the Americans, the airborne experiment was an industrial challenge. For the British, it was a question of survival. The American Airborne Division was designed as a sledgehammer of democracy. When the call went out for the formation of the 82nd and later the 101st Airborne Divisions, the United States Army did not seek quiet professionals, they sought aggressive volunteers. They offered jump pay, a significant financial incentive that attracted a specific breed of soldier: risk-takers, brawlers, and men from the hard-scrabble corners of the Depression-era Dust Bowl who had nothing to lose. At camps like Toccoa in Georgia, these men were forged in a crucible of physical punishment that was unprecedented in American military history. The doctrine was built on the concept of mass. The American strategy was to flood the night sky with thousands of troopers, overwhelming the enemy's decision-making loop through sheer chaotic volume. For the German intelligence officers studying these new formations, the American paratrooper represented a terrifying anomaly. He was not the conscripted peasant they faced on the Eastern Front. He was physically larger, better fed, and equipped with semi-automatic firepower that the average Wehrmacht infantryman could only dream of. The standard American paratrooper carried the M1 Garand, a rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as the soldier could pull the trigger. A squad of 12 American paratroopers could put more lead in the air than a German platoon. This created a doctrine of aggressive suppression. The Germans noted in their pre-invasion reports that American airborne tactics were often unrefined, relying on the gangster tactics of closing with the enemy and overwhelming them with fire superiority. They expected the Americans to be dangerous when attacking, but fragile when cut off from the logistical tail that fed their hunger for ammunition. Across the Atlantic, the British Airborne was evolving from a darker, more clandestine route. The British Parachute Regiment was not born from the idea of mass invasion, but from the desperate need for commando raids. In the dark days after Dunkirk, when Britain stood alone, the only way to strike back at the Reich was with small, highly trained bands of saboteurs. This DNA of commando was woven into the fabric of the British Airborne divisions. At their training grounds at Ringway and Hardwicke Hall, the emphasis was not just on physical fitness, but on psychological hardening and self-reliance. The British paratrooper, the Tom, was trained to fight alone, with limited ammunition, often against impossible odds. The equipment reflected this philosophy of scarcity. While the American jumped with a semi-automatic rifle, the British paratrooper jumped with the Lee Enfield bolt-action rifle or the cheap mass-produced Sten gun. They did not have the luxury of fire superiority. Instead, they relied on the Bren gun and the discipline of the bayonet. German veterans who faced them in North Africa and Sicily began to notice a disturbing trend. When American units were surrounded and ran low on ammo, the volume of fire dropped and their maneuvering became hesitant. When British units were surrounded and ran low on ammo, they fixed bayonets and waited. The Germans called them Rote Teufel, Red Devils, not just for the color of the maroon beret, but for the ferocity with which they defended a patch of dirt. This distinction in doctrine created two different fear profiles within the German Wehrmacht. The American Airborne Division was viewed as a strategic storm, a massive, blunt instrument that would shatter the front line and pave the way for the tanks. The fear was of being overrun, of being drowned in a sea of olive drab and tracers. The British Airborne, however, was viewed as a tactical poison. The Germans knew that if a British battalion seized a bridge or a crossroads, digging them out would require an expenditure of blood and artillery that the Reich could ill afford. They were not a storm, they were an infection that hardened instantly upon contact with the ground.
By 1944, as the planning for the liberation of Europe reached its zenith, the German High Command had developed specific protocols for dealing with these threats. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with defending the Atlantic Wall, studied the topography of Normandy with a paranoid eye. He ordered millions of Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, wooden stakes wired with explosives, to be planted in the open fields to impale the gliders. He flooded the river valleys. But beneath these physical defenses lay a psychological assumption. The German generals believed that the airborne soldier, deprived of his link to the main army, was a wasting asset. They believed that time was on the side of the defender. They assumed that if they could isolate the landing zones, the American morale would crack under the pressure of encirclement, and the British discipline would eventually crumble under the weight of heavy armor. They were right about the isolation. They were dead wrong about the breaking point. The German confidence in breaking the airborne invasion was rooted in a specific mathematical calculation, the ratio of armor to flesh. The Wehrmacht generals, particularly those of the Panzerlehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division, viewed paratroopers as light infantry. In military terms, this classification was a death sentence. Light infantry lacked the heavy guns to stop a Tiger or a Panther tank. The Germans assumed that once the initial shock of the landing wore off, they could simply drive their armored columns through the drop zones and crush the paratroopers under their tracks. They had done it before in Russia. They had done it in the early days of the war. They judged the Allied capabilities by the graveyard of their own airborne ambitions in Crete, where the Fallschirmjäger had suffered such grievous losses that Hitler forbade mass jumps for the rest of the war. They projected their own failure onto the enemy. This projection led to a fatal underestimation of the American soldier's ability to improvise. The German doctrine relied on Ordnung, order. A unit fought effectively when it was cohesive, in communication, and led by officers. They expected the American drops to be chaotic, scattered by flak and poor navigation, which they were. But the Germans mistook this chaos for weakness. They did not understand that the American paratrooper training emphasized fighting in little groups of paratroopers, LGOPs. If an American private landed 5 miles off target, alone, with nothing but a knife and a grenade, he did not surrender. He looked for the nearest sound of gunfire and started walking toward it. The Germans expected to fight a disorganized army. Instead, they found themselves fighting 10,000 individual wars in every hedgerow, barn, and ditch. The American chaos was not a bug. It was a feature that paralyzed the German command and control, as no officer could tell where the front line actually was. However, regarding the British, the German anxiety was technical rather than tactical. The Wehrmacht armor commanders had a deep professional respect for the British ability to bring heavy weapons to a light infantry fight. While the Americans relied heavily on the C-47 transport plane, the British had invested massively in the heavy glider program, specifically the Himmelkar. These massive wooden gliders could carry the 17-pounder anti-tank gun and its towing vehicle, or the lighter 6-pounder, directly onto the battlefield. To a German tank commander, this was a terrifying prospect. It meant that a British airborne unit wasn't just a group of men with rifles. It was a portable anti-tank battery that could land behind him. Intelligence reports from the Panzer Division stationed near Caen reveal a specific dread of the Red Devil anti-tank screens. They knew that the British doctrine called for seizing a perimeter and essentially turning it into a fortress. The British paratrooper carried the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It was a crude, spring-loaded weapon that looked like a piece of plumbing and kicked like a mule. But unlike the bazooka, it could be fired from inside a building without the backblast killing the user. This meant that in the urban combat of a French village or a Dutch town, every window could hide a British paratrooper capable of knocking out a Panzer IV. The Germans expected to fight a disorganized army. Instead, they found themselves fighting 10,000 individual wars in every hedgerow, barn, and ditch. The American chaos was not a bug. It was a feature that paralyzed the German command and control, as no officer could tell where the front line actually was. However, regarding the British, the German anxiety was technical rather than tactical. The Wehrmacht armor commanders had a deep professional respect for the British ability to bring heavy weapons to a light infantry fight. While the Americans relied heavily on the C-47 transport plane, the British had invested massively in the heavy glider program, specifically the Himmelkar. These massive wooden gliders could carry the 17-pounder anti-tank gun and its towing vehicle, or the lighter 6-pounder, directly onto the battlefield. To a German tank commander, this was a terrifying prospect. It meant that a British airborne unit wasn't just a group of men with rifles. It was a portable anti-tank battery that could land behind him. Intelligence reports from the Panzer Division stationed near Caen reveal a specific dread of the Red Devil anti-tank screens. They knew that the British doctrine called for seizing a perimeter and essentially turning it into a fortress. The British paratrooper carried the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It was a crude, spring-loaded weapon that looked like a piece of plumbing and kicked like a mule. But unlike the bazooka, it could be fired from inside a building without the backblast killing the user. This meant that in the urban combat of a French village or Dutch town, every window could hide a British paratrooper capable of knocking out a Panzer IV. The Germans expected to fight a disorganized army. Instead, they found themselves fighting 10,000 individual wars in every hedgerow, barn, and ditch. The American chaos was not a bug, it was a feature that paralyzed the German command and control, as no officer could tell where the front line actually was. However, regarding the British, the German anxiety was technical rather than tactical. The Wehrmacht armor commanders had a deep professional respect for the British ability to bring heavy weapons to a light infantry fight. While the Americans relied heavily on the C-47 transport plane, the British had invested massively in the heavy glider program, specifically the Himmelkar. These massive wooden gliders could carry the 17-pounder anti-tank gun and its towing vehicle, or the lighter 6-pounder, directly onto the battlefield. To a German tank commander, this was a terrifying prospect. It meant that a British airborne unit wasn't just a group of men with rifles, it was a portable anti-tank battery that could land behind him. Intelligence reports from the Panzer Division stationed near Cannes reveal a specific dread of the Red Devil anti-tank screens. They knew that the British doctrine called for seizing a perimeter and essentially turning it into a fortress. The British paratrooper carried the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It was a crude, spring-loaded weapon that looked like a piece of plumbing and kicked like a mule. But unlike the bazooka, it could be fired from inside a building without the backblast killing the user. This meant that in the urban combat of a French village or a Dutch town, every window could hide a British paratrooper capable of knocking out a Panzer IV. The Germans expected to fight a disorganized army. Instead, they found themselves fighting 10,000 individual wars in every hedgerow, barn, and ditch. The American chaos was not a bug, it was a feature that paralyzed the German command and control, as no officer could tell where the front line actually was. However, regarding the British, the German anxiety was technical rather than tactical. The Wehrmacht armor commanders had a deep professional respect for the British ability to bring heavy weapons to a light infantry fight. While the Americans relied heavily on the C-47 transport plane, the British had invested massively in the heavy glider program, specifically the Himmelkar. These massive wooden gliders could carry the 17-pounder anti-tank gun and its towing vehicle, or the lighter 6-pounder, directly onto the battlefield. To a German tank commander, this was a terrifying prospect. It meant that a British airborne unit wasn't just a group of men with rifles, it was a portable anti-tank battery that could land behind him. Intelligence reports from the Panzer Division stationed.
To witness the raw texture of this fear, we must drop into the boots of a German grenadier in the 91st Air Landing Division, stationed in the confusing dark hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula on the night of June 6th. The fear here is acoustic. It begins not with the sound of battle, but with the sound of nature being violently disrupted. The German sentries report hearing a metallic click-clack in the darkness, the sound of the American cricket toy used for identification. To the German ear, it is a sound without location, coming from the north, the south, the east, and the west simultaneously. The Wehrmacht is trained to fight a linear battle, to identify a front line and flank it. But against the American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd, there is no front line. The map on the wall of the German command post is useless. Every grid square is marked with a question mark. When the firefights begin, they are short, violent, and incredibly loud. The German soldier is armed with a bolt-action Mauser, a weapon of precision that requires a deliberate cycle between shots. He faces American paratroopers wielding the M1 Garand and the Thompson submachine gun. The difference in fire volume is overwhelming.
A German patrol stumbles into an American LGOP, a little group of paratroopers, and is instantly washed away by a wall of semi-automatic lead. The fear that grips the German ranks is the fear of the swarm. They feel as though they have kicked a hornet's nest inside a dark room. Reports filter back to headquarters describing the Americans as madmen who attack without support, without officers, and without fear. The psychological impact is paralyzing. German units freeze in their positions, terrified to move, believing they are surrounded by a massive force, when in reality they are often pinned down by 3 lost Americans with a machine gun and a bad attitude. The American style of fighting is visceral and chaotic. They use the darkness as a weapon. They cut the telephone lines, ambush the staff cars, and frag the mess halls. For the German soldier, the night becomes a monster. He feels a deep professional indignation. This is not how war is supposed to be fought. It is too messy, too unpredictable. He expects the enemy to consolidate and attack at dawn. Instead, the Americans are hunting him in his own rear area while he tries to sleep. The gangster label suddenly stops being a piece of propaganda and becomes a terrifying reality. These men do not fight like soldiers, they fight like muggers. But shift the scene to the bridge at Bénouville, Pegasus Bridge, or later to the suburbs of Arnhem, and the German experience transforms from a fear of chaos to a dread of precision. Here, the German garrison troops are not listening to crickets in the bushes. They are listening to the wind whistling through the struts of massive Horsa gliders. The arrival of the British Airborne is not a scattershot dispersal. It is a surgical strike. The one moment the German sentry is pacing the bridge, the next a wooden giant crashes into the earth 40 yards away, and 20 men with blackened faces sprint out, moving with the synchronized lethality of a single organism. The fear of the British Red Devil is the fear of the immovable object. Once the British paratroopers seize an objective, a terrifying metamorphosis occurs. They stop moving, they dig in, they sight their Bren guns with mathematical precision, and they wait. A German panzer commander rolling his Mark IV tank toward the British perimeter expects the light infantry to scatter. Instead, he faces a silence that is more unnerving than the American noise. He closes within 200 yards, and suddenly the lead tank erupts in flames. The British have brought their 6-pounder anti-tank guns in the gliders, or they're firing Piats from the second-story windows. The fighting here is intimate and savage. The British do not spray the area with bullets like the Americans. They fire single-aimed shots. A German officer noted in his diary that fighting the British paratroopers felt like fighting armed stones. You could pound them with mortars, you could drive tanks at them, but they would not break. In the ruins of Oosterbeek, the Germans found that they had to demolish a house brick by brick to get the Red Devils out. And even then, the survivors would be waiting in the rubble with bayonets fixed. The fear here is not of being ambushed, it is the exhaustion of fighting men who simply refuse to acknowledge the reality of being outnumbered. The German soldier knows that to take a British position, he will have to walk over his own dead to do it. The ultimate stress test of these fears arrived not on the beaches, but in the moments when the paratroopers were cut off from the world, when the German strategic assumption that encirclement equals surrender was put to the trial. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the XL 74th Panzer Corps surrounded the town of Bastogne. Inside were the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The German commanders, following their doctrine, believed the Americans were finished. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and freezing in summer uniforms. The German general von Lüttwitz sent a formal demand for surrender, expecting the gangster morale to collapse under the pressure of imminent annihilation.
The famous one-word reply, "nuts," confused the German translators, but the subsequent action terrified the German infantry.
The Germans expected the Americans to huddle in the cellars and pray for relief. Instead, the Screaming Eagles conducted an aggressive, mobile defense. They raided the German lines at night. They used their artillery with devastating, miserly precision. The German soldier in the Ardennes forest realized that he was not besieging a trapped victim. He was locking himself in a cage with a wounded predator. The fear of the American paratrooper in winter became the fear of his unpredictability. He did not act like a soldier following orders. He acted like a man fighting a personal grudge. The Germans found that the tighter they squeezed the perimeter, the more violent the American reaction became. The siege of Bastogne did not break the 101st. It broke the schedule of the entire German offensive. Contrast this with the British experience at Arnhem in September 1944. Here, the 1st Airborne Division dropped directly onto the heads of 2 SS Panzer divisions. They were not merely surrounded, they were engulfed. The small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost seized the north end of the bridge and held it. The German reaction was initially dismissive, infantry attacks to clear the nuisance. When those failed, they sent in the armored cars of the SS Reconnaissance Battalion. The British Paratroopers, firing from the windows of the houses overlooking the ramp, annihilated the column. The burning wreckage of German armor blocked the bridge, turning the German counterattack into a smoking traffic jam. The fear that grew in the German ranks at Arnhem was a mix of frustration and awe. The British were cut off from water, food, and ammunition. The houses they occupied were methodically pulverized by Tiger tanks firing at point-blank range, and yet the shooting did not stop. The German infantrymen, the veterans of the Russian front, described the battle for the bridge as rat war. They had to clear the British out room by room, often finding the defenders fighting with nothing but fighting knives and the last rounds in their Webley revolvers. The Germans respected the Americans for their firepower and aggression. They feared the British for their inhuman endurance. At Bastogne, the Americans fought to live. At Arnhem, the British seemed perfectly willing to die, provided they took enough Germans with them. This difference in breaking point led to a distinct psychological verdict among the enemy officer corps. Interrogation reports of captured SS officers reveal a startling nuance. They described the American paratroopers as tactically reckless but strategically stubborn. They feared the Americans because you couldn't calculate what they would do next. An American platoon might attack a tank with a bazooka, or they might call in an airstrike that leveled the entire grid square. But they described the British paratroopers with a term usually reserved for their own fanatics, Kämpferherz, fighter's heart. The German commander at Arnhem famously observed the destruction of the British 1st Airborne with a sense of tragic respect. He noted that while the American paratroopers relied on their equipment and their endless supply drops to sustain their morale, the British morale seemed entirely internal, disconnected from the reality of their situation. When the British finally surrendered at the bridge, only because they had physically run out of bullets and the buildings were collapsing around them, the SS troops offered them cigarettes and chocolate. It was a gesture not of kindness, but of relief. The Germans had looked into the abyss of the British fighting spirit and found it bottomless. Ultimately, the enemy learned that the 2 Allied airborne forces were 2 different kinds of unstoppable. The American paratrooper was a storm, loud, violent, and overwhelming. You feared him because he brought the full weight of the New World's industrial violence down on your head, even when he was surrounded. The British paratrooper was a stone, silent, hard, and immovable. You feared him because he broke the logic of war. He refused to acknowledge that he was beaten. As the war entered its final months, the German soldier knew that if he saw a green American shoot, he was about to be attacked. If he saw a British glider, he was about to be denied the ground he stood on. Both paths led to defeat, but one was a sudden explosion, and the other was a slow, grinding bleed.
The strategic reverberations of these airborne operations forced the German High Command to fundamentally rewrite their defensive manuals for Western Europe. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht realized that the concept of a linear front was obsolete. They could no longer rely on rivers like the Rhine or the Maas to serve as natural moats for the fatherland. The existence of the American and British airborne divisions meant that the front line was not just the trench in front of them, it was the sky above them. This paranoid reality forced the Germans to hold their precious panzer reserves further back from the line, dispersed and camouflaged, waiting not for a breakthrough on the ground, but for the white blossoms of parachutes in the rear. This dispersion diluted their strength. They could not mass their armor to stop the Allied tanks because they had to keep looking over their shoulders for the Allied paratroopers. The lessons learned at Blood, at Normandy, and Arnhem also transformed Allied doctrine, leading to a brutal evolution in how these elite forces were deployed. The lesson of Arnhem was clear. Dropping light infantry too far from the main armored thrust was a bridge too far. The British Airborne had proven they could hold out against impossible odds, but they could not hold out forever. The American Airborne had proven they could sow chaos, but chaos alone did not capture territory. The solution was to merge these styles into a single, overwhelming sledgehammer. This new doctrine was unveiled in March 1945 during Operation Varsity, the crossing of the Rhine. It was the largest single-day airborne drop in history, and it was designed to be the final, crushing answer to the German resistance. In Varsity, the Allies did not drop miles away from the objective to preserve the element of surprise. They dropped directly onto the German guns. The American 17th Airborne and the British 6th Airborne descended right on top of the German positions near Wesel. The German defenders, dug in to repel a river crossing, suddenly found themselves in a hand-to-hand fight inside their own trenches. The American gliders, now towing improved artillery, landed amidst the flak batteries. The British Hamilcars, carrying the light tanks, crashed through the fences of the German command posts. It was a chaotic, bloody brawl that lasted only hours, but it shattered the German defenses from the inside out. The Germans, expecting a siege or a maneuver battle, were instead subjected to a vertical riot. This operation highlighted a crucial shift in how the enemy perceived the two forces. Intelligence reports from the Rhine sector show a distinct change in German prioritization. The Wehrmacht commanders began to target the British gliders with frantic intensity. They had learned that a British glider was not just a transport, it was a Trojan horse carrying the heavy weapons that anchored the line. If they could destroy the Hamilcars, they could turn the British paratroopers back into light infantry. British flak gunners were ordered to ignore the transport planes and focus their fire on the plywood giants silently slipping toward the earth. It was a testament to the fear the Red Devils had instilled. The Germans were more afraid of 6 British men with a 17-pounder gun than they were of a stick of American riflemen. However, the American contribution to this new way of war was the perfection of the airhead logistics. The Germans watched with dismay as the Americans turned captured fields into functioning airports within hours. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Luftwaffe had tried to starve the 101st Airborne by bombing the drop zones. But by 1945, the American air superiority was so total and their supply drops so massive that the German strategy of encirclement and starvation became impossible.
The American paratrooper was never truly cut off because the sky belonged to him. This realization broke the will of the German commanders. They knew that even if they surrounded an American airborne unit, the Americans would just call in a resupply of ammunition and cigarettes and then continue the attack with renewed fury. The integration of these styles created a dilemma the Germans could not solve. In the final drive across Germany, the British airborne were used to seize and hold the vital bridges, acting as the immovable anvil. The American airborne were used as the mobile hammer, riding on the tanks of the armored divisions or conducting short hops to clear the towns ahead. The German army, fragmented and exhausted, found itself trapped between the British refusal to yield ground and the American refusal to stop advancing. The paratroopers, once dismissed as light infantry who would break under the treads of a Tiger tank, had become the vanguard of the Allied victory. They had forced the Wehrmacht to fight a war in 3 dimensions, a challenge for which the rigid, depleted German military had no answer.
As the Third Reich crumbled into rubble, the presence of the Allied airborne forces began to dictate the very psychology of the surrender. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, German units, cut off and demoralized, often sought out specific opponents to capitulate to. Intelligence officers noted a strange pattern. Wehrmacht commanders were terrified of surrendering to the Russians, indifferent to surrendering to the regular American infantry, but hesitant to surrender to the paratroopers. There was a lingering fear, bred from the brutality of Normandy and the Ardennes, that the airborne troops, men who had been trained to fight behind enemy lines without mercy, would not be inclined to take prisoners. The reputation of the 82nd and 101st as gangsters who carried trench knives and fought with a personal vendetta had terrified the German rank and file. Conversely, the reputation of the British airborne as disciplined, cold professionals offered a different kind of intimidation. A German officer surrendering to a Red Devil knew he was surrendering to a man who had likely watched his friends die at Arnhem and had held a grudge with a quiet, seething intensity. This psychological dominance extended into the post-war interrogation camps. When high-ranking German officers were asked to evaluate the Allied infantry performance, they consistently singled out the airborne divisions as the only Western units that matched the fighting ferocity of the Waffen-SS. General Hasso von Monteuffel, the architect of the Ardennes offensive, admitted that the American paratroopers at Bastogne had fought with a fanatical cohesion that he had not expected from a democratic army. He noted that while the regular American army fought a war of material, the paratroopers fought a war of spirit. This admission was a profound shift. For years, the German military had convinced itself that it possessed a monopoly on martial valor. The paratroopers shattered that illusion. They proved that free men, fighting for a cause they chose, could endure hardships that broke the conscripts of a dictatorship. The operational legacy of this dual fear shaped the future of warfare long after the last shot was fired. The American doctrine of vertical mass, flooding the zone with aggressive, self-reliant fighters, became the blueprint for the modern air assault concepts used in Vietnam and beyond. The idea that chaos is a weapon, that you can drop 1,000 men into the dark and trust them to find the war on their own, remains the core tenet of the U.S. airborne spirit. The German fear of the unpredictable American was validated by history. The U.S. military embraced the chaos, institutionalizing the idea that the individual soldier's initiative is more dangerous than the general's plan. On the other side of the Channel, the British experience at Arnhem and the Rhine cemented a different legacy. The British Paratroop Regiment became the custodians of a standard of endurance that borders on the mythical. The German respect for the Red Devils was essentially a respect for elite professionalism.
the ability to hold a position until the ammunition is gone and then hold it some more. This philosophy of fighting outnumbered and winning became the cornerstone of the modern British Special Forces. The SAS, drawn largely from the Paratroop Regiment, inherited this DNA. The fear the Germans felt for the tactical poison of the British Airborne, the knowledge that a small group of these men could paralyze a much larger force, is the same fear that modern adversaries feel when facing British special operators today. In the final analysis, the German military machine was dismantled by a combination of American energy and British resolve. The paratroopers were the tip of that spear. They forced the enemy to look up, to doubt the security of their own rear areas, and to question the superiority of their own soldiers. The German commanders expected the Americans to be soft. They found them to be savage. They expected the British to be rigid. They found them to be unbreakable. By the time the war ended, the maroon beret and the screaming eagle patch had become symbols of a new kind of warfare, one where the front line was everywhere and safety was nowhere. The sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe's terror, had become the delivery system for the Reich's destruction.
When we stand today at the simple stone monuments near St. Mère Église or the quiet bridge at Arnhem, we are not just looking at battlefields, we are looking at the birthplaces of a new world order. The German commanders, trained in the rigid academies of Prussia, looked at the sky and saw a tactical problem. They calculated lift capacities, drop zones, and ammunition loads, but they failed to calculate the human soul. They believed that by cutting the supply lines to the American paratrooper, they would cut his will to fight. They believed that by surrounding the British paratrooper with tanks, they would crush his spirit. They were wrong, because they viewed war as a collision of machines, not a collision of cultures. The Americans brought the spirit of the frontier to the skies of Europe. They fought with a raw, chaotic energy that defied the textbooks, a belief that if you just keep moving, keep shooting, and keep attacking, the enemy will eventually break. They proved that a free citizen, when given a mission and a rifle, is more dangerous than any conscript of the state. The British brought the spirit of the island fortress. They fought with a quiet, terrifying stubbornness, a refusal to yield that turned every bridge and every basement into a monument of resistance. They proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that some things are more important than survival. Separately, these two forces were vulnerable. The Americans could be scattered, the British could be isolated, but together they formed a complete answer to the tyranny of the Axis. The Germans feared the American chaos, but they respected the British order. In that distinction lies the genius of the Allied victory. It was not won by a single doctrine, but by the weaving together of two national characters, the audacity to jump into the dark and the fortitude to stand in the light. The paratroopers did not just break the German line, they broke the German belief in their own superiority. And in doing so, they wrote a lesson in the clouds that stands to this day. Tyrants may build walls, and they may build tanks, but there is no fortress high enough to keep out men who are willing to fall from the sky to be free.